The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Today we're going to explore the life and career of Ed Bolden, arguably the most influential figure in the history of Philadelphia's old Negro Leagues. Between 1910 and 1950, Bolden, a skilled businessman and shrewd baseball scout, owned two teams, the Hilldale Daisies and the Stars. He won two Negro League championships, the first in 1925 with the Hilldales and the second in 1934 with the Stars. Bolden was also officer in three different professional leagues, the Eastern Colored League, the American Negro League, and the Second Negro National League. I'm pleased to have as my guest Courtney Michelle Smith, Associate Professor of History at Cabrini University in suburban Radnor, and author of Ed Bolden and Black Baseball in Philadelphia. Welcome to the program, Courtney.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let's begin with you. What inspired your interest in Ed Bolden?
Well, when I was a graduate student, I had to prepare for my master's thesis, and as an undergraduate, I took a class, really the first class that Cabrini offered, called Baseball and the American Tradition. And from that, I was exposed to the literature on baseball history. So then when I went to grad school, I decided to combine three of my loves. I combined baseball, Philadelphia, and history, and I was encouraged to pursue Negro League baseball because that was an unexplored topic. And when I came across that history, I came across Ed Bolden, and it's hard to avoid him because he was so prominent and played such a large role in Black professional baseball in the Philadelphia area. And really looking at him and his career, what really broadened my interest in him was that if you look at what he did, it really revealed how the people who were part of Negro League baseball had to be so versatile. They couldn't just be owners. They also had to play a role in finance. They also might have had to make some decisions about on-field personnel. So really, he's just a fascinating character.
You did your PhD at Lehigh University?
Yes, I did.
And your concentration was American 20th century history?
Yes, it was American 20th century history with a focus on popular culture history.
Oh, great interest. That's really good. I mean, history, it never ceases to amaze me, all the different fields in history that are out there. When I was doing my doctorate in the 1980s, early 90s, the history of education was really a brand new field, and that is where I went to. But man, there's history of science, there's popular culture, there's American studies. Actually, that field's probably gone now, but it never ceases to amaze me. All the different fields that are opening up in history.
It's really diverse.
At the turn of the 19th century, Philadelphia was home to several successful black ball clubs. Some of those clubs were the Pythians, the Giants, and of course the Derby-based Hilldales.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the racial demographics of Philadelphia at this time, and really by association Derby, which is 5 miles to the west of Philadelphia.
Correct. So when black baseball began in Philadelphia, Philadelphia had the reputation of being having one of the largest free black populations in the country. It was the center of free black cultural life with things like the Free African Society. So it had a large population. And then really what benefited, particularly for Hilldale, was that when Hilldale was establishing itself in the early 20th century, Philadelphia witnessed a growth in black population because of the Great Migration. and the black population more than doubled in the first 20 years of the 20th century. And so that benefited Philadelphia. Hillsdale, though, and other Negro League teams didn't just have a black fan base, they had a mixed race fan base, and Philadelphia was home to a significant number of foreign-born European immigrants, really from all parts of that continent. You mentioned Derby. Derby was similar to Philadelphia in that it had a mixed race. It was a mixed race community. It had a strong black middle class. Ed Bolden worked in the post office. That was considered to be one of the most prestigious jobs available to African American men, especially middle class men. And that fan base or that community in Derby had the means to support a Hillsdale corporation, which in turn supported Hillsdale.
Now, it's interesting you say mixed race and refer to the white European immigrants. At that period of time, that's what they later called the new immigration, came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Did they have an interest in black baseball?
Yes, the fan base, the team, the crowds that would go to games weren't necessarily all black. They would be mixed race, especially when black teams played at major league stadiums like Shibe Park, later known as Connie Mack Stadium. There weren't too many white fans who would venture out to West Philadelphia to watch the Stars play in their ballpark. Their ballpark was kind of old and dirty, and so it wasn't an inviting place. But in many Negro League contests, especially contests that were held at Yankee Stadium at Comiskey Park, they would attract white fans.
Now, for younger listeners, the so-called gentleman's agreement in the 1890s barred blacks from the white professional leagues, and these early black teams had to form their own leagues as a result. Courtney, tell us, how successful were Philadelphia's early Negro League teams?
They had a somewhat mixed record, and it's really hard to determine or to put them into a broader context because league play didn't exist. It does seem like the early teams did have some success. The team, though, that had the most success was Hillsdale, and Hillsdale really overshadowed anybody else playing in the vicinity. They played in the first two World Series for Negro League teams in 1924 and in 1925. They won the second time, and in both of those instances, they played the Monarchs. It's really hard to determine about those early teams is they have lack of stability. Financial problems prevent them from really establishing themselves, and so it's hard to determine how successful they were because they come and they go. Hillsdale was sustained, and so that's why it has, I think, a stronger reputation than some of those other early teams.
It's baseball and patriotism have a symbiotic, actually American history have a symbiotic relationship, and particularly in the early 20th century. So, we're talking about baseball being a tremendous source of racial pride for the African American community, not just in Philadelphia, but also around the country, and that's why we had the proliferation of these teams. And that's another thing I think, many younger baseball fans don't understand, at an age where now football and basketball and increasingly soccer are the popular sports among youth. But baseball was the sport at this period of time. Even football and basketball were considered forms of recreation or a way to stay in shape for the baseball season. So it was critical for blacks really to get a piece of the American dream and using baseball as a way to do this. Now, Courtney, you mentioned Ed Bolden. It was a Philadelphia post office worker when he came onto the scene in the spring of 1910, the year that he organized the Hilldales, which was once an amateur boys club team. and Bolden was the one who turned it into a professional Negro League team. How did he do that?
That's a great question. I think he benefited greatly from the fact that league play didn't exist in the 19 teens, and that's when he made his move, taking this group of sandlot amateur players and making them into one of the top professional teams in the country. He didn't have to follow league rules, so he could go out and get the best talent available and not have to worry about a fellow owner who might have that talent under contract. He also formed with other African American men the Hilldale Corporation, and that provided Hilldale with the financial resources it needed to have its own ballpark, to make other improvements that made it clear that Hilldale was no longer a sandlot team, but that it was a top professional team. And Bolden, for his lifetime in baseball, he picked good players. So he seemed to have an eye for good talent as well. But I really think the thing that made them the most successful, and this is something Bolden referenced later on, was that they were independent. They didn't have to follow league rules. They could follow whatever rules the Hilldale Baseball Corporation wanted to follow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In your book, you show that the Hilldales were an extremely successful franchise. Under Bolden's ownership, they won the first 3 Eastern Colored League pennants beginning in 1923. In 1925, the Hilldales won the second Colored World Series. As you mentioned before, they were involved in the first 2 Colored World Series. Hall of Famer third baseman Judy Johnson was a Hilldale regular for most of the team's glory days, 1918 to 1932. You also had other Hall of Famers like Oscar Charleston, Biz Mackey, and Louis Santop, who were important Hilldale regulars in the 1920s. With that kind of success, why hasn't Hilldale gotten the same top billing in history as the Kansas City Monarchs or the Homestead Grays, which are usually the 2 teams that everybody references, as the most successful in Negro League baseball?
Well, I think one thing is that the other two teams you mentioned, the Kansas City Monarchs and the Homestead Grays, they played in the 1930s and 40s. They, in other words, played when there was a great deal of attention devoted to black professional baseball, specifically to Negro League baseball. And that was because of a push for integration, and there was a search for top players, and not surprisingly, these teams had some of the players that major league teams, or one major league team in particular, the Dodgers, targeted for bringing onto their squads. Hilldale, unfortunately, disappears. It doesn't survive the Great Depression. It plays its last game in the early 1930s. And because of that, it misses out on those opportunities that were there in the 1930s and in the 1940s. And I think some baseball historians do recognize that Hilldale had those great players, but Kansas City Monarchs had Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson was the first player in Major League Baseball in 20th century, and so that, I think, elevated them. Kansas City Monarchs also had a much longer history. They were playing against Hilldale in the 1920s, and 20 years later, they're still one of the top teams in black professional baseball. Unfortunately, you can't say that about Hilldale. Hilldale had an amazing arc, and I think because their arc was so amazing and so quick, it died out very quickly as well. So Bolden quickly formed this, he made this team into a professional team, but then when financial problems hit Philadelphia, hit the rest of the country, the team flamed out. And I think that's the biggest reason why.
Tell us about Ed Bolden as a person. What were his most outstanding traits? What kind of personality did he have?
It's kind of hard to determine what his personality was. I've tried to piece together what I can discern from things that he wrote and things that he did. he definitely seemed devoted to his family, and he was very devoted as well to his actual full-time job at the post office, a job he held on to well into the 1940s. I came across records from his performance at the post office, and he did his job very well. He was one of the top people in the post office. He had he gained praise from his supervisors at the post office and from his coworkers. He also was somebody, though, who had an edge to him. And he had at least one nervous breakdown, and this nervous breakdown came in 1927, and it came when the problems that Hilda was facing were really starting to fall on his shoulders. In the wake of that breakdown, he had a bit of an edge. He broke up the Eastern Colored League. He built that league as a rival to Rube Foster's first Negro National League. He broke it up. He also tried to break up the Hilldale Baseball Corporation. He wasn't successful with that, and it seemed like at the time when he was evicted from the Hilldale Baseball Corporation that his baseball career was over. So that to me says that he possessed a fierce determination to succeed and to really excel in the field of black professional baseball. Mm-hmm. Later with the Stars, you can see that fierceness, you can see that determination. He occasionally threatened to quit the league that the Stars were, that this was the new Negro National League, and he threatened to quit it because he didn't like the way the league was operating. He thought that they weren't giving the Stars their due. He thought that they were cheating the Stars out of one of the half-season championships. He also would take action against players. He would sign players, set very high expectations for them. If they didn't succeed, he threatened to cut them, and sometimes he did cut them. He was known to make huge roster changes in the middle of a season. The one thing I came across that I thought was the most revealing about Bolden was the 1 year he spent with the Derby Phantoms. The Derby Phantoms were an amateur team, and he did this after he was pushed out of Hilldale. And from what I could gather, looking at what he was trying to do, it looked like he was trying to make the Derby Phantoms into the new Hilldale, the new team that he would take from the Sandlot to the professional ranks. But he left them after 1 year, and he had an opportunity to form the Philadelphia Stars, which he did. This didn't sit well with some members of the Derby Phantoms, and one in particular wrote a very lengthy letter in the local black newspaper, the Philadelphia Tribune, that criticized Bolden. So Bolden was fierce. He wasn't someone to be taken lightly. He had a determination to excel in baseball, and he was going to do whatever it took to do that. So that's what I can gather from Bolden in terms of the kind of person he was. But he did make inroads into the Philadelphia community. When he died in 1950, there was a very long list of community leaders who were at his funeral, who were his pallbearers. These were politicians. These were members of the local fraternal lodges. These were members of the Philadelphia Post Office. So he definitely made an impact in the Philadelphia community. So I think he was someone who made an impact, was determined to excel, and sometimes had an edge about him when things didn't go his way.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a great answer, because I did get the impression from your book, particularly after I read that Bolden was responsible for the destruction of the Eastern Colored League, that this was just the typical Negro League owner. The Negro Leagues were notorious for poor administration, and clearly the owners were motivated more by financial self-interest than those of their players. The players weren't paid well, sometimes not at all. There was a lot of defection from teams, which resulted in the disbanding of teams and the destruction of other leagues. So it does sound like, Bolden was just as greedy as the other owners were. And despite that, he was a tremendous innovator in the game. You mentioned several ways that several innovations that he had made to professional baseball. Tell us about some of them.
Well, to me, the biggest innovations happen off the field. The way that he built the Hilldale Corporation, actually having this all African American corporation that would support a black baseball franchise. That was incredibly innovative for its time because it came up 100 years ago, and you just didn't see stuff like that in other teams and other franchises. And because of that support, the franchise could own its own ballpark. That was something else you just typically did not see in Negro League baseball. Most of the Negro League teams had to rent from white owners, white booking agents who would book their games in those ballparks. So that was, I think, really, to me, really innovative. He also would do things prior to the season. He had training regimens for players that he felt would work well. To save money, they would train in Philadelphia rather than go south, and that was a double-edged sword because on the one hand he was saving money, but on the other hand they also missed out on playing games that could have helped their players really stay in shape and be prepared for the season. And then you see again his innovations coming in after integration. After integration happens, what do we do now with the Stars, with these teams that are full of black players, but they're no longer have a monopoly on black players? And so he was really innovative in trying to make the franchise a stepping stone, almost like a proving ground for major league talent.
Mm-hmm. One of the statements you make that really stuck with me from the book, because for whatever reason, I didn't make the I didn't make the connection. But you write that Bolden's activities as an owner, quote, often parallels to the leaders and organizations that advance civil rights, and that statement really stood out with me because this is a transitory period in African American history. You have W.E.B. Du Bois, who, in the 1890s writes the Philadelphia Negro, and points out that the quote-unquote crime and venality of the Negro of Philadelphia itself, which was blamed upon by white middle-class Philadelphians on blacks, is a major issue with this period of time. You also have a previous generation of leaders, William Still, who was the great Underground Railroad figure, and Octavius Cato, who died for black voting rights. You have all these figures that have laid the groundwork for a budding civil rights movement. And then you have Ed Bolden, who really is, in many respects, I guess, the new generation of black leaders, who, frankly, is an entrepreneur, and he's using his baseball club in that way. The so-called talented tenth that Du Bois speaks of in his Philadelphia Negro, that tenth of the Negro population or black population that were businessmen and trying to make inroads to the black community. And at the same time, it is Bolden's generation of blacks who are making greater ties to Philadelphia Jews, another dispossessed class. He actually joins with Eddie Gottlieb, I guess, in the Stars, the formation of the Stars. So, your statement that Bolden really was, in so many respects, part of this budding civil rights movement, which really, I won't say came to its peak, but began in 1956 with the Montgomery bus boycott, really is a wonderful insight into what's going on at this time period in Philadelphia.
Yes. Yeah, I think when I was doing my research, I could see a definite link between previous people. You mentioned William Still. There was also James Fortin and Octavius Pato, who led to Ed Bolden. And I think for some people that may seem odd because Ed Bolden was a baseball owner, but baseball and civil rights go very much hand in hand. Look at Jackie Robinson. I think in 1947 when Jackie Robinson debuted with the Brooklyn Dodgers, seeing an integrated team on the field, and it wasn't, of course, just the Dodgers, it was very quickly after that the Cleveland Indians as well. Seeing that, I think, helped to prepare many Americans for seeing integration in other aspects of American life. And I think Bolden was very much a leader in his own right in terms of, really becoming, standing on the shoulders of the people who were before him in Philadelphia history and really offering an example for others to follow later on about civil rights, about just leadership in general, business leaders, and just, again, the remarkable connections he made to politicians, to business leaders in Philadelphia that you could see at his funeral.
Mm-hmm. Now, was this book, Ed Bolden and Black Baseball in Philadelphia, was this part of a dissertation?
It was actually part of my master's thesis that I wrote at Lehigh University. That's where the research began, and then it became the book after I got my PhD and started working at Cabrini.
Mm-hmm. So what are your future plans? What kind of research are you going to be doing, or anything in the works for baseball?
I'm thinking about how I can use what I wrote about Ed Bolden, to expand my focus on other aspects of Philadelphia life and culture in the 20th century. I'm also considering about taking this focus on baseball and shifting it to integration, about looking at integration broadly in Philadelphia and using baseball and the other sports as a lens through which to examine issues involving integration in Philadelphia. And that could then be part of the literature on integration in other northern cities.
That's wonderful. Yeah, keep us posted. Folks, again, the book is Ed Bolden and Black Baseball in Philadelphia. The author has been our guest, Courtney Michelle Smith, and the book is available online through McFarland Publishers. And Courtney, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.